We are turning our attention now to Michigan, where the mom who was convicted of starving her child to death is trying to retain custody of her youngest.
1. Shanda Vander Ark. The story begins in Muskegon, Michigan, inside a home where silence hid something unspeakable. Behind closed doors, Shanda Vander Ark's teenage son, Timothy Ferguson, was slowly wasting away. At 15 years old, he should have been filled with restless energy, a boy on the verge of adulthood. Instead, his body was frail, his strength drained, his weight reduced to what one prosecutor later described as the size of a child half his age. When authorities finally documented his body, Timothy weighed just 69 pounds. That haunting number would echo through every step of her trial. Shanda wasn't an unknown figure in her community. To neighbors, she was a mother raising a boy with challenges, a boy with special needs who required care and patience. But what no one realized was how different life looked inside her home. Food wasn't nourishment, it was control. Meals were measured out, locked away, or withheld altogether. The refrigerator became forbidden territory. Cold baths replaced warmth. Hunger was a weapon. Slowly, Timothy's body gave out under the weight of relentless deprivation. The breaking point came in July 2022, when emergency responders were called to the house. They were met not with a medical crisis that could be reversed, but with a lifeless, starved body. To seasoned investigators, the sight was unforgettable. It was not illness. It was not accident. This was suffering imposed, a death by design. And as details surfaced, the picture grew darker. Timothy hadn't simply slipped away unnoticed. He had been forced down this path, his cries met with indifference, his needs treated as burdens, not responsibilities. At the center of the courtroom later, the moment that froze everyone came not from legal argument, but from the stark recitation of facts. A 15-year-old boy, weighing 69 pounds at the time of his death. Jurors didn't need imagination. They didn't need speculation. They could see it. The sharp angles of bone where there should have been muscle, the signs of prolonged neglect. That was the moment that shattered any remaining defense. Whatever explanations Vander Ark offered, they collapsed in the face of Timothy's body itself. The trial became a battle, not over what had happened, but why. Prosecutors argued she weaponized starvation, systematically cutting off her son's access to food, even when relatives begged her to get help. Witnesses described her locking cupboards, rationing meals to the point of cruelty. The defense countered with claims about her own struggles, but it never changed the brutal math of the case. 15 years alive, 69 pounds at death. A boy denied even the basic dignity of being fed. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Shanda Vander Ark was found guilty of murder and first-degree child abuse. The sentencing reflected not just the crime, but its enduring horror. Life in prison, with no chance of parole, plus an additional 50 to 100 years on the child abuse charge. For Vander Ark, the prison gates would never open again. For the community, the sentence carried a message as stark as Timothy's fate. Michigan courts would not treat this as neglect, not as failure, but as murder. Deliberate, unrelenting, merciless. A mother had turned the act of feeding into a weapon of control, and the punishment had to be absolute. Today, Shanda Vander Ark exists only as a number in Michigan's correctional system, her name tied forever to the boy she deprived of life. Timothy's story, however, lingers beyond the courtroom. A warning etched into memory. When jurors spoke afterward, many mentioned that weight, 69 pounds. More than any testimony, it was that single number that defined the case. A fact too raw, too searing to ever be forgotten. And so, in Michigan's long roster of women serving life without parole, Vander Ark's place is marked not only by the crime itself, but by the haunting image of a boy reduced to a fraction of what he should have been. She will never walk free again. And Timothy will never grow older than 15. Linda Stermer. It was January 7, 2007, in rural Michigan when Linda Stermer. It was January 7, 2007, in rural Michigan when chaos erupted on the Stermer property. Neighbors looked out their windows to see a man engulfed in flames, sprinting across the snow-covered ground, his body burning as he screamed for help. That man was Todd Stermer, and within moments, he would collapse. His wife, Linda, would later insist it had all been an accident, a tragic mishap with oil lamps and candles. But the story prosecutors unveiled in court revealed something far darker. A sequence of violence so cruel it stunned even seasoned investigators. To the outside world, Linda and Todd looked like an ordinary married couple. They had built a family together, raised children, shared the quiet routines of Michigan life. But beneath that exterior, their marriage was unraveling. Todd had discovered Linda was having an affair, and the cracks in their relationship widened into chasms of resentment. Friends would later recall the tension in the household, the bitterness that seemed to grow with each passing month. On that frigid winter day, according to prosecutors, Linda put her plan into motion. They argued that she attacked Todd inside their home, striking him until he fell. Then, in an act both brutal and theatrical, she doused him with gasoline. Fire consumed the room, and Todd himself was transformed into a human torch. Desperate, he fought his way outside, clawing through the doorway and stumbling into the snow. His final act was not one of reconciliation or forgiveness. It was the sheer animal instinct to survive. The most unforgettable detail, the one that froze jurors and still echoes in accounts of the case, came not from the flames themselves, but from what happened next. Todd, badly burned, managed to escape the house. But Linda, prosecutors said, climbed into her van and pursued him. As he tried to flee down the driveway, she struck him with the vehicle. Witnesses later described the horrifying image of Todd lying broken, his burns and injuries fatal, his final escape attempt crushed beneath the weight of the van. That moment, more than anything else, convinced the jury this was not an accident. It was execution. In court, Linda clung to her version of events. She told jurors she had been trying to escape a fire, that Todd's injuries were tragic consequences of a domestic accident. Her defense painted her as a panicked woman, not a murderer. But prosecutors methodically dismantled her claims, pointing to inconsistencies in her statements, the implausibility of her timeline, and the forensic evidence that suggested the fire had not spread the way she described. The trial was a spectacle of clashing narratives, Linda the desperate wife versus Linda the killer. But as testimony stacked up, the weight of the evidence pressed heavily against her. Experts testified about the burn patterns, about gasoline's role in the blaze. Investigators described the damage to the van, consistent with striking a body. Piece by piece, the picture came together. And it was damning. Linda was convicted of first-degree murder, and the sentence was automatic: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For a time, she managed to fight back through appeals, even securing a retrial when questions were raised about the first trial's fairness. But in the end, the retrial produced the same result. Jurors once again heard the story of fire and violence, once again saw the image of Todd ablaze in the snow, and once again decided Linda Stermer's place was in prison until the day she dies. The aftermath left deep scars. For Todd's family, the tragedy was almost unbearable, watching a loved one die in such agony, only to have his memory dragged through years of courtroom battles. For the community, the Stermer case became a haunting reminder of how quickly domestic life can turn lethal, and how betrayal between spouses can ignite not just arguments, but firestorms of violence. Today, Linda Stermer remains in a Michigan prison, serving life with no chance of freedom. The image that sealed her fate, Todd on fire, running through the cold air, only to be struck down in his final desperate bid for survival, will forever define her story. The flames may have burned out that day, but the memory of what happened has not dimmed. 3. Susan Brown. The courtroom was silent when the judge read the sentence. Susan Brown, a woman once seen as a survivor of domestic violence, was now condemned to live out her days in prison with no chance of parole. Around her, the air was thick with the weight of contradiction. A battered wife who became a convicted murderer, a story of abuse ending not in escape, but in life behind bars. To those who knew Susan outside the prison walls, her story began long before the crime. She had endured years in a violent marriage, years of being belittled, beaten, and controlled. Family and friends would later describe her as trapped in a cycle of terror, carrying bruises on her body and fear in her eyes. She tried to break away, but her estranged husband always seemed to pull her back, through intimidation, manipulation, and sheer force. When the final confrontation came, it was explosive. According to her defense, Susan's husband had attacked her in a rage, lashing out with fists, words, and threats. In that moment, she claimed she fought for her life. The prosecution told a different story, not of a desperate woman defending herself, but of a calculated act of murder. Susan, they argued, had crossed the line from victim to killer. The pivotal moment in her trial arrived with the forensic evidence. Jurors were shown photographs, presented timelines, and heard experts explain details that cut into her self-defense claim. The prosecution pointed to wounds and circumstances that, in their view, suggested intent rather than survival. The defense countered with testimony about years of abuse, about the psychological scars that left her hypervigilant and fearful. But in the end, the jury's focus narrowed to a single decision. Was Susan Brown a victim acting in desperation, or was she a murderer who used her history of abuse as cover? The answer came back in the harshest terms the law allows. First-degree murder. Mandatory life in prison. No parole. No reprieve. In Michigan, that meant the cell was not temporary. It was forever. The most unforgettable scene of her case, the one that struck observers hardest, was not the recounting of the abuse, nor even the grim details of the killing. It was the moment the verdict was announced, when Susan, who had once begged for safety and protection, heard that the law saw her not as a victim, but as a perpetrator beyond redemption. For many watching, the sound of that sentence felt like a final gavel, not just on her case, but on her entire life. Her story didn't end in silence. Advocates for survivors of domestic violence have since pointed to Susan's case as an example of how the system can punish women whose lives were shaped by trauma. They argue that her conviction ignored the context of her suffering, reducing years of abuse to a footnote rather than a factor. To them, Susan's imprisonment is not just about one killing, but about how society judges women who fight back against violent men. Prosecutors, however, have stood by their case. They maintain that Susan's actions crossed a line, that whatever her past, the killing itself could not be excused. To them, the life sentence wasn't about silencing her history, but about ensuring accountability for the act itself. Today, Susan Brown sits in Michigan's Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility. Her name rarely appears in headlines anymore, but among those who track women serving life without parole, hers is often cited as one of the most complex. She is both a cautionary tale and a case study, a woman whose life story embodies both victimhood and violence, ending in a sentence that erased any hope of release. For some, her imprisonment is justice. For others, it is tragedy layered upon tragedy. But for Susan herself, the reality is stark. Every morning, the same walls, the same gates, the same certainty that freedom is gone. Her story remains suspended between two truths: the battered wife who lived in fear, and the convicted murderer who will never walk free again. Before, Paula Renai Bennett. On a summer night in 2007, a woman named Stephanie McClure stepped into what she thought was a routine moment in her life. Instead, it became her final one. Lurking in the shadows of that night was a plot that had been quietly set in motion, and at the center of it was Paula Renai Bennett. Unlike other cases where the killer strikes directly, Bennett's role was different, but no less devastating. She became the guide, the enabler, the one who led the victim toward her death. To those who knew her, Paula was not the kind of figure you'd expect in a homicide case. She wasn't the one wielding a weapon or leaving behind forensic evidence. She was a mother, a woman with her own complicated life. But in the trial that followed, prosecutors revealed her hidden involvement in a crime that stripped away any illusion of innocence. The case revolved around her partner, Kyron Benson, who had threatened violence against Stephanie McClure. Paula, fully aware of those threats, drove him to McClure's home, pointed him toward the trailer, and helped him reach his target. When the confrontation turned fatal, Stephanie's life was gone, and Paula's future was sealed. The unforgettable centerpiece of her trial came when prosecutors laid out her decisions step by step. She hadn't struck the fatal blow, but she had cleared the path. She had made the choice to aid and abet. In Michigan, that distinction carries no mercy. Under state law, first-degree murder does not just punish the hand that kills. It punishes the one who helps make it possible. Mandatory life without parole, no exceptions, no second chances. In court, Paula's defense tried to paint her as caught up in someone else's violence, a bystander swept along by a man's rage. But prosecutors countered with evidence of intent. She wasn't passive, she was active. She provided the ride, gave the directions, and enabled the crime. To the jury, it was enough. Her role wasn't accidental, it was participation. The verdict was swift. Guilty of aiding and abetting first-degree murder. The sentence automatic, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. For Paula, there was no spectrum of punishment, no scaling down to account for her not being the one holding the weapon. Michigan law made no distinction. Her involvement was enough to ensure she would die behind bars. For the community, the case left a bitter taste. Some saw her as a calculating accomplice who had betrayed another woman by facilitating her death. Others viewed her as another example of how accomplices, especially women, can be handed the same punishment as the killers themselves. But in the eyes of the court, there was no debate. A life was taken, and Paula's role in making it happen meant she had forfeited her own freedom forever. The most haunting part of Paula's story is not in the act itself, but in the permanence of her punishment. She sits in Michigan's prison system as a reminder that the law can be unforgiving, especially in cases of first-degree murder. There is no parole board to appeal to, no future commutation promised, only the certainty that her sentence will last as long as her life does. Her case now lives in the same breath as others who receive the harshest sentence the state can hand down. But what sets hers apart is the role she played, not the direct killer, but the accomplice. It shows that in Michigan, when it comes to first-degree murder, the line between principal and partner vanishes. Both carry the same fate. Today, Paula Renai Bennett's name remains etched in Michigan's records of women serving life without parole. She is not remembered for the life she lived before the crime, but for the moment she chose to open the door to someone else's violence. In the end, her legacy is one of betrayal. Betrayal of another woman's trust, betrayal of her own chance at freedom. And so, like the others in this story, Paula will never step outside prison gates again. Her role as an accomplice bound her to a sentence as final as if she had delivered the fatal act herself. A life ended that night, and another life, her own, was consigned to a cell without end. Outro. And there you have it, 4 women in Michigan whose names are forever etched into the darkest chapters of true crime. Shanda Vander, who starved her son until his body gave out. Stermer, whose husband fled his burning home only to be struck down. Susan Brown, the battered wife who crossed the line from victim to killer. And Paula Renai Bennett, the accomplice who helped guide another woman into her death. Each of them now wakes up every day knowing there is no parole hearing, no second chance, and no possibility of freedom. Their punishment is permanent. Their prison sentence is forever. But what do you think? Should life without parole be absolute, no matter the circumstances, no matter the story behind the crime? Or should there be room for reconsideration in cases touched by abuse, manipulation, or coercion? Do you believe the law always gets it right? Or are there times when the punishment may go too far? Your thoughts matter, and I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And if this video kept you locked in, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more people discover these stories. Share this with someone who follows true crime as closely as you do. And make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next deep dive into the cases that shock, disturb, and fascinate us. Every case leaves questions that linger long after the verdict. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.